Blog Talk Radio.
Greetings. Thank you for tuning in to the C.O.W.S context of white supremacy. Thank you. I hope the program has been constructive. If you are tuning in, I hope you are getting helpful information. Again, try to say this as consistently as possible. If you do not find the information on the program constructive, helpful, please find something better to do with your time. This program sorry about that. Brief technical difficulties. But again, if the information that you are getting on the program is not constructive, please invest your time and energy in something that would be more helpful, more informative. We do not want to waste time. We want to solve the problem of racism, white supremacy as soon as possible. I want to hop right into today's broadcast. Today's guest had hands down, the best workshop that I saw from La Crosse, Wisconsin, and the White Privilege Conference. Just incredibly informative and very honest, accurate information. She presented a workshop called The Invention of White People in Law. Fantastic. I almost missed it because I was talking to somebody else at the conference and they said it's probably going to be just like Haney Lopez's White by Law, so it'll just be a lot of regurgitation. And I decided to go anyway because I've read the book and he's been on the program. Hopefully today's program and the program with Professor Lopez, they will go nicely together. I think this is going to be a very important program. I hope you listen closely and really pay attention to what's being presented. Our guest, she is a professor at Xavier University's University. She's a professor at Xavier University. And as I said, easily best workshop that I saw from the White Privilege Conference. Real treat to have her on the program. Our guest, Jacqueline Battalora. I'm going to make sure, because I have a couple people that called in, so I want to make sure I hit the correct line here. Let's see. Is this it? Professor Battalora, is that you?
I'm here.
Yes. Okay, got the right one. Hi, thank you so much for taking some of your time to speak with us. I know you have a very busy schedule.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. If you could just give kind of a brief summary of the work that you do and what you teach exactly.
Sure. My area of study really is in critical race theory, and in particular I focus on construction of whiteness in U.S. law. In terms of teaching, of course, I manage to sneak that in almost every class I teach, but the array of courses that I teach include social theory, crime theory, law, courts, and justice, race, class, gender in the law, feminist jurisprudence, and a bag of other courses of similar ilk. Largely in the arena of sociology and overlapping oftentimes, or sometimes at least, with criminal justice.
Okay. Wow, okay. I want to hop right into the program because I feel like the information that I got from the workshop at the White Privilege Conference was fantastic, so I want to try and share as much of that with the listeners as possible. I warmed them up. I told them the same day that I went to the workshop, I broadcasted. I did a program and told them how much I learned and how important I thought the information was. So I want to hop right to it. This program, the C.O.W.S, Context of White Supremacy, I have unfortunately concluded that we are in a global system of racism, white supremacy, and the definition that I use for both racism and white supremacy is as follows. A global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white. Do you believe that such a system exists, and do you think that definition is accurate?
I do. The only caveat I would want to add to that, or I guess it's only implied, but let me just shed one piece of contour to that. In my own experience of teaching, and that would be of teaching largely white students, I feel fairly confident in saying that the majority of the people that I teach, the majority of whom are white, when they discover that they're participating in these systems, more often than not, they are very disturbed. Now, how long that is sustained, I can't really say. But I think that your definition is correct. The only concern I have with it is that it suggests a consciousness, and I think, in fact, the work that I do in terms of my research, I think helps to establish how insidious white supremacy is, and that there's no need for it to be conscious anymore. It's so pervasive and so insidious and so much a part of everything that is normal, in quotes, in the United States, that it helps it not be a conscious effort.
I agree 100%. We actually had Professor Dana R. Carney from the Columbia Business School. She was on the program last week, and I told her I was going to be referencing her work from this point forward because she has done many studies and concluded exactly what you just stated, that it does not have to be conscious, that white people that she has done research on, they practice racism and mistreat people because they are not white unconsciously. In fact, we agreed that's the default setting in a system of white supremacy. The default setting is white supremacy, mistreat because not white. So, yeah, I totally agree. I don't think white people have to be conscious, although I think you can definitely be dedicated to an idea without being conscious. And I think that's demonstrated, unfortunately, with the system of white supremacy. You are a white person, correct?
I am.
Okay, outstanding. I would like to hop right to the theory so we can spend as much time as possible fleshing that out for folks listening in. Again, non-white folks listening in, please pay sharp attention. Excellent information. I was thoroughly impressed at the conference. Thoroughly impressed. So this should be a fantastic program. I guess I'll set it up the same way the workshop that I participated in, same way that workshop began. A black male asked, what does it mean to be white? And you began your presentation talking about how, I guess the standard line is that racial classifications, racism, identifying certain people as white began with Bacon's Rebellion, and this was all done in the name of keeping control of workers. We don't want white people and black people getting together and making trouble for those in power. And you deviated from that theory and said you had a different theory on how all this began. I guess, can you pick it up from there?
Absolutely. I'm happy to. Yes, what Bacon's Rebellion is held out among academics, and specifically Theodore Allen. He wrote a 2-volume text, and it dives into nuances and amazing detail around Bacon's Rebellion. And the title of Alan's book is called The Invention of White People. So I obviously read this text with great hope in learning about this, because my own studies in colonial American law caused me to ask this question about, when did white people come about? And I specifically focus on anti-miscegenation law, which I will talk about and describe in a few minutes. So I read Theodore Allen's book on the invention of white people that, again, focused around Bacon's Rebellion. And really what I found is that Allen's work shows us that it firmly establishes that after Bacon's Rebellion, there was a need to divide laborers. Because in the rebellion, which occurred in the colony of Virginia, and lasted more than a year, mind you, there was the laborers, the masses of laborers, united across today what we see as lines of race, and fought against the plantation elite. So they revealed the threat of a united labor force. And after Bacon's Rebellion is when we see a proliferation of laws crafted that identify this group of humanity called white, and those people who fall into that group are given all kinds of things, and I can give you a few examples. When one's term of servitude is up and you are white, you are to be given a gun and a certain amount of gunpowder and other payment by law in the colony of Virginia. In contrast, one who is labeled of African descent or a person of a First Nation is prohibited by law from having a gun or gunpowder. And there's a laundry list of these laws that gave things by law to those who were in this group white and denied things by law to those who were of African descent and Native American. So Bacon's Rebellion then represents the need to divide laborers. What I hope to add, academics always like to talk in terms of critiques, and I would rather think of my contribution as adding to Allen's work. There is no explanation of why white became the mechanism to divide people, white in relation to people of African descent and people of First Nation. And in fact, because of the way in which whiteness is treated, it's almost reified. The problem with how whiteness is treated as almost a given, as if it was a necessary way to organize humanity, I think it's very dangerous. And so when I approached this project, I said, well, wait a minute, Bacon's Rebellion doesn't tell us why white became the mechanism to divide people, or a critical component of that mechanism to divide people, because of course white by itself wouldn't work. You had to have white plus these other categories that were seen as differentiated. So I wanted to really dive in to explore, well, why? Why did white become the mechanism, one of the key mechanisms to do this? And so I had already begun some research on anti-miscegenation law, and so that's what I'm going to dive into right now, and I'll try to link it up with how whiteness became the mechanism to divide folks. Because what Bacon's Rebellion really represents is the need on the part of the slaveholding elite to keep laborers divided so that they no longer could pose the tremendous threat that Bacon's Rebellion represented. So let me take us back in time then. Since Bacon's Rebellion occurred in the 1676, and it lasted over a year, I'm going to take us back to 1664, and I'm going to take us to the colony of Maryland. Maryland and Virginia are at the forefront of this conversation because the two colonies were heavily invested in tobacco farming And tobacco farming, if you know much about it, requires tremendous human volume to produce such a crop. And so another reason that Virginia and Maryland are at the forefront is because it is out of those colonies that we find the dramatic breaks from the common law of Great Britain. So let me provide a legal context here, and then I'll provide a sort of general social context as well. First of all, Maryland and Virginia, as well as all of the other British colonies, we can say that the common law of Great Britain was the norm. It provided the legal framework for law in these colonies. Because this is so, anytime the colonies broke with British common law, you want to pay attention. Red flags should go up. And so I want to talk about some of those breaks from British common law. In Virginia, one of the most significant breaks from British common law was the determination of the status of a child being determined by the status of the mother, and that is the key status being whether slave or free. Under the common law of Great Britain, it's the father's status that determines the status of the child. But in Virginia, this was changed to the mother, and in fact, every Southern colony adopted this dramatic shift from British common law, with the exception of Maryland, and eventually Maryland did so as well. So that was one significant break from British common law. Another was anti-miscegenation law itself. What is anti-miscegenation law? Well, anti-miscegenation law are laws that make it illegal for white people to marry those who are racially identified as non-white. And they're passed at this point, obviously colony by colony, but eventually state by state. And those of whom white people are prohibited from marrying it can be a variety of different folks, but every anti-miscegenation law prohibited a white person from marrying a person of African descent. So these are a couple critical breaks from British common law that we see in the colonial context. A few other things to know about just the general context during the colonial era. And again, Maryland and Virginia are going to be at the forefront. There was a tremendous gender imbalance because most of those coming to the colonies as indentured servants were men. And I've heard a range of estimates as to how many marriage age males per marriage age females there were. So it's a range. I don't want to give a specific amount, but somewhere between 7 to 12 men for every woman.
Wow.
So the next common law component that we want to be aware of is the Law of Coverture. It's also derived from British common law, and that's law that concerns marriage and gender relationships within marriage. And really the famous legal quote by Blackstone is this, that in coverture the two become one and the one is the man. So quite literally a female who marries, her legal rights, her legal status is completely dependent upon a man. She has no right to her own wages. Any property that is bequeathed to her in a will or as a beneficiary becomes that of her husband. So these are all important these are sort of important legal balls to hold up in the air as we talk here. So 1664 is where I brought us the colony of Maryland. This date represents the first anti-miscegenation law to exist. Again, this law is not derived from the common law of Great Britain. And this law in particular tells us that British women and other freeborns are prohibited from marrying enslaved Negroes, is the language of the statute. Now, the statute is important for a number of reasons. First of all, it represents the seed of future anti-miscegenation law. And it's important because the language that was utilized in this statute to justify the prohibition, the marriage prohibition, tells us something about this group that will eventually be labeled white. So let me move into what we learn within the statute.
Okay.
In the Archives of Maryland, the particular statute at hand tells us that British women and those who are other freeborn women, that these marriages, that British people represent freedom, and therefore that justifies the imposition of this law. So I've always actually found that kind of humorous, right? That we justify a law that limits you, right, because it's restricting who these British women can marry, based upon the rationale that you're free, right? We're restricting freedoms based upon a rationale that you're free. So I think that's an interesting thing to realize. And when you read the statute as a whole, you find that the ideas about the British are that they are deserving of rights and privileges from which others can be denied. And, of course, the other component of this particular statute is that it only restricts women from these marriages, British and other freeborn women from marriages with enslaved black men. So to focus upon those who are the object of the law, of the controls, I should say, within the law. So here's one of the unexpected turns with regard to this law. It says in the statute that the law was crafted, the Anti-Miscegenation Law in Maryland of 1664 was crafted to prevent women from entering, and I'll quote the statute, such shameful matches, unquote. But an effect of the law was, in fact, to encourage these marriages, and this is why. Because what it did, the punishment for engaging in such a marriage was that the British woman then, or other freeborn woman, became enslaved to her husband's master for the duration of her husband's life. And any children born of the couple is enslaved for many years. So why wouldn't slaveholders encourage such marriages? It just increased their holdings. So it was in the correction to this law, and it was corrected in a statute passed in Maryland in 1681. And this particular statute is really important for our conversation about whiteness because it is the first time in law that white is utilized to reference a group of humanity. First time, 1681. And so there's a few things that need to be addressed here. First of all, in the language of this statute, we find that such marriages are described as to the lascivious desires of those who might enter into them. So we see that this sort of excessive sexuality is being assumed, and of course deviant sexuality is being assumed by those who would enter into these marriages. So in 1681, we have the first appearance of white to represent a group of humanity. And this was not part of that package of laws that came out of Virginia in the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion. So that's another important thing to realize. So why white? Why was white being utilized? Well, we certainly know that as early as the 15th century, we had descriptions of people as white or black or red even. Shakespeare's Othello, of course, comes to mind. But they were just that, descriptive, like one can be said to have yellow hair or brown hair. Never were they intended to represent a specific quality that created a unique group of humanity. This, however, the colonial passage of this enactment in 1681 does in fact do the latter. It does suggest a group of humanity with unique qualities, labeled white. So who are these white people then? Well, if you again turn back to anti-miscegenation, the first anti-miscegenation law that again this 1681 law was correcting, who were they talking about? Well, they were talking about the British, and what's interesting is you can see in previous laws the struggle to label people, right? Because think about it. First it was the British. They could craft laws and just use the terminology British, and that was fine. It worked for a while. However, with the influx of other peoples, that became more problematic or insufficient, let's say. And so then what kind of language do we see? Well, first we see British and other Christians. But that was unsatisfactory because those who were already identified as unlike the British, specifically those of First Nations and those of African descent, could convert. So that was a problem with that labeling effort. British and Christian, other Christians became a problem. And in fact, you can find legislation in Maryland that specifically states that conversion to Christianity does not result in manumission. So we see in the laws that there was anxiety there about what it meant for those who were enslaved to convert to Christianity. Okay, so that labeling effort, British alone didn't work. British and other Christians was problematic because of conversion. So the next labeling effort that we see, and we saw it in the Anti-Miscegenation Law of 1664, is British and other freeborns. Well, that has its problems too, because at this time in particular, there were respectful numbers of free persons of African descent, and of course, those of First Nations were largely born free. So these labeling efforts are troubling to the landholding elite, and particularly those in positions to shape law. So what does this tell us about whiteness? Well, we know a couple things. We know that those who would become white were this group of people who were seen by the British as like the British. What would make one like the British? Well, being Christian helps. Being freeborn helps. But because those other labels had the problems that I identified, and really the problem is this: among this elite class of those who served in the legislatures, at least in Virginia and Maryland, we can say this for certain, they viewed those of First Nations and those of African descent as sufficiently unlike the British to, first of all, give them independent labels. And Winthrop Jordan was one of the first to recognize that naming somebody as other is a huge difference, is the first step in difference making. And so for that group anyway, that elite group of lawmakers, these groups, those of African descent and those of First Nations, were different, sufficiently different from the British. And you can see that in these two areas. You see that in this new anti-miscegenation law, and you also see it in Virginia, also in the 1660s, in their fornication law. And this is how. Fornication were laws that punished folks for having sexual relations outside of marriage or extramarital sexual relations. What the Virginia fornication law did was that when a white person was involved in fornication with a person of African descent or of a First Nation, the fine was doubled. So we can see before Bacon's Rebellion that those of African descent and those of First Nations were viewed by this elite group as sufficiently un-British-like. Now, that's in contrast to the masses of laborers. In fact, that's one of the points that Theodore Allen and numerous other historians actually really raise, and they really contest that there were these ideas of human difference along the lines that we are all too familiar with today. And their evidence for this is that among the laborers, there was tremendous intermarriage. Obviously less so in Maryland because it was prohibited, but in Virginia in particular, there's lots of evidence of intermarriage. But what I think needs to get folded into that is that among that elite class, there is significant evidence that those of African descent and those of First Nations were being seen as other than the British. So these people who became white, and again, don't forget, white people really were invented or created. I kind of like the word created because it implies all of the Christian symbolism that I think is, sadly appropriate in this context. It captures all of that. Pardon me.
Can you?
Have a sip of water.
No problem. No problem. Take your time. Again, our guest, Jacqueline Battalora, St. Xavier University. I guess can you make sure you share that why you felt the Christian symbolism is appropriate for this topic? Sadly, you said. Well,
sure. Sadly, well, because again, one of my areas of expertise is studying anti-miscegenation law, and when you read the law's anti-miscegenation cases, especially those that arose after the Civil War, when the legality of these laws was challenged in light of the civil rights legislation, you see courts utilizing notions of Christian ideas to justify it. For instance, here's one of them. If God did not intend different colored people to be divided, then why were they put on different continents? But for the intervention of mankind, we would not be together. Therefore, God intended us to be separate. Then there's this story of Ham and Abel that gets deployed in some of this legal justification for dividing people, for upholding these marriage prohibitions against white people, really. Because don't forget, not a single anti-miscegenation law prevented people understood as racially different from marrying each other unless one of the parties was white. For instance, a person of Japanese descent could marry a Native American. Even though both were understood to be racially distinct, not a single anti-miscegenation law prohibited such a marriage. So those who claim that anti-miscegenation law prohibited interracial marriage, that's factually incorrect. Anti-miscegenation law prohibited marriages between white people and certain other groups understood as not white.
Very important detail. I hope people caught that. I want to make sure I summarize before you give us your theory on why these particular features, these phenotypical features were selected as this is what we're going to loosely be talking about when we classify individuals as white. But I just want to make sure that I understood what you said correctly, and the listeners as well, that in your studies, you first see the term white used in law, 1681, and it is in association with anti-miscegenation laws restricting sexual intercourse between white people, primarily white females, and non-white people. And you see these ideas in other fornication laws. The fine is doubled if you're having fornication. This is in Virginia. If a white person is having sexual intercourse with a non-white person, that you really, I guess in essence, you see the establishment of white in law in miscegenation laws. Is that correct?
That's correct. Let me just make one brief correction. Anti-miscegenation law, fornication law was separate usually from anti-miscegenation law, and anti-miscegenation law prohibited marriage.
Oh, okay. No
so
marriage.
That's
Gotcha.
the key there. And I mean, what I think is important to realize is that there was, on the part of the British and other European elites who wielded the most power in these colonies, there was a struggle to find a label to capture who this privileged group was going to be. And the labels that came before white, I think, help us understand why white became the label chosen. It doesn't give us the full answer, but it helps show us that whatever label we were going to use, it couldn't have this conversion problem, right, that Christianity posed. It couldn't include, by virtue of being born free, those who we already have clearly established are not like the British. So those two things that the previous labeling efforts helped establish, those were unacceptable. So what that helps to show is that those experiences, those labeling efforts that were insufficient, helped to narrow the field of possibilities for labeling this group that was seen as like the British. And so it makes sense then, or more sense, again, it's not a definitive, aha, here's how white. White was not the necessary choice. It could have been 1,000 other things that were deployed to label this group. But because of the previous labeling efforts and their deficiencies that I've identified, it narrowed the field, and it makes it a little more reasonable that an element of phenotype would become something that was seen as very useful, because obviously it's not readily changed and from the outset it already excludes the vast majority of those who were already identified, at least by this elite group, less so for the laboring classes, but for this elite group, excluded those of First Nations and of African descent because they viewed those groups as sufficiently unlike the British. The other, let me just offer one other thing I think about white as the label given for this new group. Not only does it have these nice features, from that position, if you will, because it is attached to one's physicality, but white also was not defined by law. In fact, as y'all know from listening to Haney Lopez's work, whiteness and white people still remain undefined as a matter of law. So the advantage that gave was that it was then, because white was not defined, it had incredible flexibility, and those with the power to define who was white or not white rested firmly in the judiciary.
I hope people who listen to this program consistently, that has been said before, white never been defined, still is not defined, and I guess the problem and or the power that one can use. If you're a white person, then I guess that's great. That's fantastic. It's not defined. You can make it whatever you want. You can change it to suit whatever your needs are. But I hope people really pay attention to that and what a gigantic problem that is, that it is not defined if you are not a white person.
That is
Do
right.
you think... Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Excuse me, Gus. You go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to ask a question, so if you had something that's relative to that, please go ahead.
Well, I just simply wanted to state that I don't think white people can just come in and define white, because to say that would be to erase the white supremacy that is built into this very invention of white people. Because again, let's go back and look at, we've already looked at the labeling efforts and saw that those who fall into this group white were those seen as like the British, or at least sufficiently like the British. And that folded in Christianity, it folded in freeborn. So that's an important thing to remember. But what else did those first statutes tell us about this group? Well, they told us that they viewed themselves as deserving of privileges from which others can be denied, i.e., they viewed themselves as superior to these other groups. So an essential component of the creation of white people is the idea that they are superior. And so
Can you say that again, please?
Absolutely. But when you look at this struggle on the part of the legislative elite in the colonies to name this group of people, we see that those who fall into the group white are those who are considered sufficiently like the British. And that, of course, folds in Christianity and folds in being freeborn. But what we also learned from that is that, remember that statute, what did it tell us? Well, it told us that the British, and therefore now white people, are deserving of rights and privileges from which those seen as sufficiently unlike the British can properly be denied. Therefore, whiteness is completely, from its origin, tied up with a notion of supremacy. Because that is true, and because, as we'll talk about, and you have talked about, I'm sure, at great length in this program, the embeddedness of white supremacy within laws and social practices and imagery and symbolism throughout this country's history, white people really don't have that freedom to define themselves. I would argue, because to say that we could just freely, we white people that is, could just, because it's not legally defined what white equals, while that is true, and I think historically it's given tremendous, it's revealed the ability of people to exert incredible oppressive power over others, it also has put a parameter around what white can be, at least for now, until these systems of supremacy and structures of supremacy are dismantled. But without the dismantling, white equals supremacy.
I have concluded the same thing, although it is fantastic to get a white person to lay the foundation down for why that is. Just as I said, creme de la creme, the White Privilege Conference in Wisconsin. Pleasure to have her on the program, Professor Jacqueline Battalora. I guess before we move forward, because you have other excellent information that I want to get out as well, still the why. Like, why these particular features? Why did so-called British people, white people, why did they feel we should set this up, we should do this? What was motivating all this? Do you have a thought as to what motivated this?
Sure. I have a couple things, I think, to offer that query, Gus. First, I want to highlight the fact that the first anti-miscegenation law only restricted British women. It applied to women and the men, enslaved black men. So notice that British and freeborn men were not part of this, nor were enslaved black women. And that was true for the corrective in 1681 as well. It only applied to British women, and to then they expanded it beyond enslaved black men to just, of course, the language of the statute was Negro, to black men, whether enslaved or not. So I want to highlight the point that inherent in this first anti-miscegenation law is something that's very revealing, and I want to talk about it in relation to anti-miscegenation law along a longer line of history in the U.S., and that is its emphasis on controlling the sexuality and relationality of white women, those who will become white, and variously identified non-white men. That's the goal of this particular law. Now, people might argue with me by saying, well, Dr. Battalora, when Virginia passed their anti-miscegenation law in 1691, theirs restricted both white men and white women from engaging in these marriages with those who were Native American or those of African descent. And while that is true, in terms of the four corners of the law, its application reveals otherwise. In fact, there's wonderful antebellum research projects, largely out of North Carolina, that reveal that anti-miscegenation law was largely enforced against white women and non-white men. So what does that tell us? It tells us that anti-miscegenation law was a tool to control white women and non-white men. And don't forget, one function then of that law is to make more white women available to white men. So when you look at this lump of I'm just going to call them goodies, especially when you look at that package of laws that were passed, especially in 1691, all the way into the early 1700s in Virginia, again following Bacon's Rebellion, you see that anti-miscegenation law was a piece of that package. And we already talked about the package being one that conferred something of value to white people and simultaneously excluding or denying value to non-white people, specifically in the colony of Virginia, specifically those of First Nations and those of African descent. So we see then, because of its enforcement, and when we look at the origination of the law, we see that one of the things that white male laborers traded in the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion was they traded unification with their fellow laborers who were then classified as not white for more access to white women, as well as this other much larger package of goodies that was conferred to them by law by virtue of their whiteness. So I don't think that should be lost, especially when we think about relationships today and sort of the role of white women as bearers of the white race and these notions of purity that then attach to that. I think that that's a very significant component. And, I have my students today write about, I'll just tell you the assignment I give to my white students because it's relevant to this program. I give my non-white students, depending upon their identity of choice, different assignments. But for the white students, I tell them this: you're going to go home and you're going to tell your parents that you're engaged to an African-American man or woman, and heterosexuality will just be presumed for this project. And what I want you to do is tell me what they're going to do and how you know it. How do you know they're going to respond that way? I want evidence that substantiates it. And I get back these papers that reveal that white women today face tremendous pressures to interact relationally, especially in serious types of relationships, with those who are exclusively white. Some white men have that same pressure, but it's only about 50% of the white men. So there is still this legacy of white women representing representing something to white people as a whole that I think has roots in this anti-miscegenation law from the 17th century.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Hearing all of this, and when I was participating in your workshop, my interest was piqued immediately because you began your presentation going to anti-miscegenation laws. And I've said consistently, my studies of racism, white supremacy, that sex and racism, white supremacy are majorly intertwined. I've seen enough discussions now that if one comes up, the other is going to come up. If you're talking about racism, sex is going to come up at some point. And if you're talking about sex, race is going to come up at some point. And I've just found that it's been very interesting to see the way that they are connected. And so when I heard your presentation, I generally don't hear white people talk about racism, white supremacy, and make that connection and really flesh out how much you can learn about racism, white supremacy by studying the dynamic of sexual intercourse. One of the reasons that I'm so interested and attuned to this is because of the work of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. She shares a lot of similar theories with you, and her view is that the reason these phenotypical features were valued and the reason that white is synonymous with white supremacy is because those features are genetic recessive. And if white people had enough sexual intercourse with non-white people, those phenotypes would disappear. You wouldn't have those anymore. Does that sound lucid? And are you familiar with her work, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing?
You know what, I'm not, although it did make me think of the documentary film from Australia, Rabbit Proof Fence. I'm not sure if you've seen that, but it documents the experience of Aborigines, and specifically those who were half Aboriginal, or quadroon, octoroon as the categories evolved, who were part white and part indigenous, and the effort underway for up until the 1970s to take these so-called mixed race children, which is when they took them, and their argument was within 4 generations, I think 3 or 4, if they're only in sexual relationships with white people, they become white. So we've managed to literally eliminate their aboriginalness, which is contrary, of course, to the theory that you just posed. So I just found that interesting because their idea was that within 4 generations you can no longer see the phenotypical aboriginal markers. So they thought that was their justification for literally stripping these children away from their mothers in an aboriginal context. And of course managing to, part of what they did, and this is another theme of white supremacy, is stole these children and then trained them to be laborers of wealthier white people.
I have seen Rabbit Proof Fence, white supremacy worldwide. Yeah, I am familiar with that. They did the reverse, which you just described. But even an integral aspect of that is that they cannot have these octoroons or whatever the terms they come up with. They can't have sexual intercourse with other non-white people. They got to just have sex with white people. I have not bumped into anyone who said that they don't think it sounds lucid, her theory in terms of those phenotypes being genetic recessive. Is that your understanding of the features that are labeled?
Yeah, I'm not a geneticist. I did take a course in undergrad, but what's coming to mind are eyes, eye color, and certainly brown is dominant, and darker features are more dominant from my learnings there. So it makes perfect sense.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Okie dokie. I guess and I thought that was great because you touched on in the workshop as well. You still see these same themes playing out today in terms of the students, or I guess what they said about how their parents would respond, particularly if it was a white woman and she was marrying someone who was not white. I believe in the workshop you said even violence was threatened against these women. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
Okay.
And really, well, what you hear most often, violence is not the most common anticipated response, but what is common is the expectation of really being rejected from the family. So what does that say? So to be a white family member, you must ensure white supremacy. You must practice it in your relationships. Well, that's a pretty dismal outlook in terms of improving race relations, right? Because what has the argument been to keep the people of this country so racially divided, right? One of the biggest fears on the part of so many white people is the realization that once we diverse peoples are together, we actually fall in love. That we realize how false these barriers are that are called race.
I think for a great many white people, I couldn't give exact numbers, but I suspect for a great many, that fear of no longer having white people, no longer having those phenotypical features because they're genetic recessive, I suspect that could be driving a lot of those fears, particularly around the sexual intercourse. I think even the fact that it's focused more intently on white women not violating the code of white supremacy and marrying a non-white person, having sex and kids with a non-white person. I think just for males, the biology of it, a white man could go and have 20 kids with a non-white female and then still come back and marry a white person, have kids with a white person. And I think that's happened a lot, particularly with war brides and all that stuff. We talked about that on the program before, but with a female, you don't have that same possibility. Pregnancy is a risky thing. A significant number of people die in childbirth. You might not be able to have additional kids. I think to maintain white supremacy, you can't have white women going out willy-nilly having sex with and kids with non-white males. I just think that would put I think the system would be out of business pretty quickly if that happened. Well,
I think, it's also true. I think all your points about the riskiness of pregnancy, of course, are absolutely valid. The one thing that I want to pull up here is that, a white woman can have a non-white baby and then have a white baby with a white person. So I don't think that's the core of this. I think what happens is we end up in these conversations about race, and then we tend to lose the power of patriarchy, which is also integrally linked with the history that we're talking about. Remember this commitment to patriarchy, and let me link it up with white supremacy. Don't forget, anti-miscegenation law originated as this control mechanism to make more white women available and to continue another level of control of black men in Maryland. In Virginia, that was expanded to American Indians. And even though the legal restriction, at least on paper, applied to white men, we know from enforcement practices that it was rarely, we know of stories of white men who had these intimate and sexual and marital relationships with non-white women, but the laws were rarely enforced against them. But they were regularly enforced against white women and non-white men. So one of the components of this that I think we have to see in these contemporary dynamics is that this control of white women by white men to keep white women available to white men is another component of this, what I think is best described as the early colonial commitments. This history reveals a commitment to a form of capitalism that was taking shape in this country and that didn't exist in other places, that was dependent on a significant class of laborers who were extremely underpaid, if not, and I use that term pay loosely to mean even referencing enslavement as a form of, well, you're given some housing and enough sustenance to at least keep your body running. So this history reveals a commitment to that version of capitalism, and also a commitment to a version of patriarchy different from that in Great Britain, because the patriarchy that took hold here was one focused around coverture and the law of coverture, but specifically for white men. Don't forget, the result of anti-miscegenation law was keeping white women available, more available to white men, and denying that degree of patriarchal privilege to specifically identified non-white men. So even the form of patriarchy that took hold in the United States during the colonial era had a significant racial component to it, or what evolved into a racial component.
I think everything has a racist white supremacist component. I think all areas of people activity are saturated with white supremacy. I mean, it is supreme. I think all systems, I think everything with regards to people activity is subordinate to maintaining white supremacy. Everything reinforces white supremacy, unfortunately. Again, our guest for today's program, Xavier University's Jacqueline Battalora, Dr. Jacqueline Battalora. From the workshop, I thought it was great the way you pointed out how you still see these themes play out today in terms of those barriers around sexual intercourse and marriage between white people and non-white people. You pointed out several films. I know Pelican Brief, Monsters Ball, a few other, well, not Monsters Ball, Pelican Brief, Hancock, quite a few where this pops up. Last of the Mohicans, the book and the film, a lot around that. I actually said on a previous program that I have seen a trend where if it's a book or a film and the white person has sexual intercourse with a non-white person, pretty consistently it's almost like a character flaw in that person. Have you noticed a similar trend with that?
I don't know. I've never. I'm trying to think as you stated that whether that would fit with me. I certainly know. Only because I'm not that. I laugh. I have a 3-year-old, so we joke that the last movie we saw was Jaws 2. I'm a little out of my movie scene, but I do know that the perception of a white person as defective is certainly evidenced in studies, and I'm embarrassed that I can't remember the name of the scholar. She writes about interracial marriages, and in her studies and her interviews with various people who are in and or out of interracial marriages in a contemporary context, you find that is how white people in particular tend to portray white family members and relatives who have married, especially African Americans. Really, the history of the United States, from my perception, reveals that those of African descent and those of First Nations are consistently placed at the bottom of the barrel in this country's history. And that doesn't deny the terrible treatment, internments, among many other things, of other groups that are defined as not white, because there are plenty of them and there are plenty of examples of degradation. But no groups have the consistency and the depth of oppression throughout this country's history as that of Native peoples and those of African descent.
Yeah, I think other people have shared similar information and even statistical information. The admitted racist known as Tim Wise cited studies that have been done that have shown that the darker you are, the worse you will be treated in the system of white supremacy, which also would directly support the theory of white genetic annihilation, that the darker you are, if these people had sexual intercourse with a white person, that the child would look less white because they're having sex with a darker person, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
Okay. I wanted also you to share, because I thought it was great. Unfortunately, it was great. And I thought it was very ironic, because the point that you raised in your workshop amidst all this was the tendency in the system of white supremacy. There's a tendency to celebrate racist acts, and you brought up the Texas Rangers, and when you explained it, I thought Washington Redskins. I mean, there are tons of examples of this, and I thought it was ironic because of where the conference was being held. But could you kind of talk about that and why you think things like this happen, the Texas Rangers and such?
Well, sure. If you don't mind, can I let me dive into a little bit of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in the 1840s, because I think that gives a historical context for this conversation about the Rangers. So here's what we know, and your listeners already know this from listening to Haney Lopez, but clearly this label given to this group of humanity that was invented in 1681 was incredibly successful. So much so that by 1790, when Congress of the United States met for the first time to establish this country's immigration and naturalization laws, it was determined that in order to become a naturalized citizen, the only process toward citizenship for those who were not born in the United States, that one of the qualifications in order to become naturalized was that one had to be white. That this law is so significant because it clearly links what many people who are not white and live in the United States of America today experience all the time, and that is that if you are white, you are viewed as American. Even if you arrived in this country yesterday, as long as you speak English, you are afforded all of the perceptual advantages of being perceived as American. And those who are not white, and this applies in particular to groups that are not African American, they are generally and most consistently viewed as not American. And this original, this law of immigration and naturalization passed in 1790 helps to historically ground that experience that people have today, and that is the link between whiteness and Americanness. So 1790, one has to be white in order to become a citizen of the United States. This remains valid law until 1952. Anti-Miscegenation Law, let's also fold it in here, first created in 1664, valid law until 1967, when it was found unconstitutional in the case Loving versus Virginia. So move into the 1840s. The Mexican-American War was underway from 1846 to 1848, and it is, well, so-called resolved in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Now, the land that the United States, many say, stole, purchased from Mexico in this treaty, was over half of Mexico and reflects states from California into New Mexico and up to Colorado. a huge mass of land. So here's the situation. Those people who yesterday, prior to the signing of the treaty, were Mexican people living in Mexico, found themselves living now in the United States. I mean, it had to be just an extraordinary experience at the time. Here are some important things about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo for our purposes of discussing white supremacy and specifically thinking about anti-miscegenation law and its role in it. The leadership of Mexico negotiated that marriages that were already made among these people, this huge mass of a population that yesterday were living in Mexico and today living in the United States, that those marriages had to be honored in the United States. And this created some very curious legal decisions because the state of Colorado, one half of it was the United States prior to the treaty, and the state almost doubled in size after the signing of the treaty. So in one half of the state, marriages between somebody who was considered white with somebody not white were legal, and in the other half illegal because the state had by virtue of international law or a treaty, and those in the other half of the state were illegal by virtue of the state's anti-miscegenation law.
Wow.
Yeah, so a really extraordinary situation there. So what occurred in the years following the Treaty of Guadalupe, especially with regard to this population of Mexicans? Well, here's what we know. We know that by the time of the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, over 60% of the Mexican households in that land, that yesterday was Mexico and today is the United States, that they owned land, over 60%. Within a decade, that percentage is less than half. It falls down to 29%. So what happened in 10 years? Well, what we have been shown historically is that there were significant lynchings and killings of persons of Mexican descent. Because don't forget, part of the ideology working in favor of whites is that they were seen as having really a God-given right to expand across this land called the United States, and that those who were already there were really largely seen as in their way because they were seen as
not white.
Well, they were for sure seen as not white, but the white people were viewed as having very much a God-given. They held this ideological directive that they were needed to go expand literally the white man's horizons on these lands. And so we know that many Mexicans were lynched during this period up through the 1930s. And to get to the point that you raised, Gus, we know that the Texas Rangers played a role in these killings. And can you imagine any team, professional baseball, football, soccer, and any other athletic team being named after a group that participated in the murder of white people? I mean, it's unfathomable. It would never happen.
For the people listening in, I guess to give you an example, that would be like instead of the Washington Wizards, you have Nat Turner's Brigade.
Yes.
If you could imagine that, being an NBA basketball team, Nat Turner's Brigade. Now, just think about that. Do you think that's an accurate comparison, Dr. Battalora?
I think that works. It raises the point of what is significant here, and that is that white lives are valued, and they have been consistently throughout this country's history. And those lives that are seen as not white are not. And again, we could turn to contemporary stats on prison populations and folks on death row. And really the legacies of this original history are so very much with us.
Again, privileged to have her on the program. St. Xavier University's Dr. Jacqueline Battalora. Yeah, I thought that was so ironic that you brought that point up, and I know at least two people that were in your workshop referenced that from your workshop immediately, because I was involved in a conversation with someone, and I was like, "Do you know anything about why this town is named La Crosse?" And they said no. That was my first time being in Wisconsin, so I didn't know either. But the day I arrived, a white woman, she said there was a statue of, it looked like some Native Americans playing lacrosse. And I was staring at it, and she said, "Oh, yeah, do you know about that statue?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Okay, the town is called La Crosse. Native population was here. They invented lacrosse." And I just thought, oh, that's kind of necrophilia to kill off the people and then take their game and name the town after it. That's kind of interesting, and I didn't hear anyone else bring up, the name of the town, and those statues were everywhere. There was one out in front of the convention center. I saw several of them during my time there for the conference, but I just thought that was another sad illustration of the Texas Rangers, the Washington Redskins, celebrating the history of white supremacy.
Yes, and really the disturbing part to me is that there are not efforts underway today as the advancements of awareness of white supremacy and white privilege on the part of white people, that we're not demanding that these the exploitation of these peoples through these symbols is not challenged. That we're failing to challenge that is so troubling to me.
Oh, it's not troubling to me. I guess this goes right back to the conference and so many of my concerns about the conference. Given what you said, and that's why I said to start all of this, what does it mean to be white? It means to believe in the idea of white supremacy and to practice that idea in your thought, speech, and action. Would you say that's accurate?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
If that's true, and I have concluded that, it is, unfortunately, I don't believe white people are going to stop doing that. I mean, it is a tremendous advantage to be a white person on this planet in a system of white supremacy. You are rewarded for practicing racism, white supremacy. It would be, I would have to say, it would almost be crazy for white people to give this up. They've got.
I actually argue, Gus, that white supremacy is required, and it's not only required of white people; it's required of everybody. That's how disturbing it is. It to make a jump, much in the way that gender advantage. I am required to participate in my own subjugation as a woman. It's demanded of me. If I live in a culture that objectifies women in so many ways, ultimately reducing us to body parts, ultimately for heterosexual male pleasure, that's a claim about gender relations and gender power relations in this culture overall. But the messed up part is that I am required in this culture to participate in my own subjugation. Things like, if I rejected these notions of beauty that ultimately work to disadvantage and objectify me, I'm not going to get a job. I'm not going to hold a job. I have to look a certain way. I have to participate in this makeup and capitalistic notions of clothing purchase and appearance. I'm required. Otherwise, I wouldn't I wouldn't be gainfully employed. I wouldn't be a, quote, success in this culture. And in similar ways, white supremacy is a requirement to be, quote, successful in the United States.
In the world, I would say. Okay. For the non-white person who's listening, because I've concluded that non-white people are very confused about racism, white supremacy. For the non-white person who's listening who says, wait a minute, Dr. Battalora, I do not support white supremacy. What you just said is not true. I don't think President Obama does not support white supremacy. I don't think what you just said is true. What would you say to that?
Well, here's what I would turn to. I would look at, I'm going to forget his name. Right before Brown versus Board of Education, the gentleman who went into Mississippi and did studies of African American youth and utilized dolls.
Stanley Clark? Kenneth Clark, I'm sorry.
Yes, Kenneth Clark. And I mean, it just gets to how insidious white supremacy is, that it's those of your listeners who are non-white who are saying, it's basically saying I can be protected from the systems of white supremacy getting into my subconscious. I just think it's not possible. All of us are bombarded with images of white supremacy every day, all the time. And so I think to pretend that we are not absorbing that is just simply untenable and unrealistic. The result of absorbing that, of course, is very different depending upon whether you're white or not white. But to think that we are not absorbing that, I just don't think that's possible.
I guess, yeah, given what you, and again, fantastic information. I hope listeners appreciate it. Given what you've said, and Haney Lopez, when he was on the program, we talked about white by law. We came to a lot of similar conclusions. I feel that was not represented at the White Privilege Conference. Even the name of the conference, I think, is not adequate to accurately convey what you just shared about what it means to be white in a system of white supremacy and the all-encompassing nature of it. I feel like I did not hear anyone voice, hey, white people are not going to discontinue the system of white supremacy, and to be white means to be a racist. I really didn't hear anyone expressing that and just talking about the ramifications of that. And I spoke with Dr. Moore. I want to make sure I get that out. I talked to Dr. Moore. We had a long chat last week, and he's coming on the program next week. So this is not, just talking bad about anybody or what have you. I've shared all these concerns. As Dr. Battalora suggested, she said he should get feedback. I wanted to get your view on that, because I know we talked, and I shared with Dr. Moore, as you suggested that I should, that you said you felt a lot of what Dr. Moore did not want, the kumbaya vibe. What did you see that made you say that?
Well, oh boy. Let me just go back to the name. Let me start there. Here's what I think. I don't know Dr. Moore's story that was the impetus for starting the conference and specifically the name that he gave to it. But here's what I can say, and I think is true generally. White people are very resistant to, well, hell, they're resistant to the label, to acknowledging white privilege, but they're even more resistant to even more honest identifications of what's going on in white people's lives. And I have my own examples of, I was offering a training seminar and somebody had improperly named it white privilege, a white privilege seminar. So even white privilege was seen as too threatening. In fact, what it's labeled is a white awareness training, precisely because I have learned that even white privilege is often very threatening for white people. But here for me is the point, that white privilege is the result and white supremacy is the cause. So, but for white supremacy, white privilege would simply not exist. My guess is that the label of the conference might reflect, and again, Eddie will have to speak to that for himself, but my guess is that it created an opening that could push white people a bit without threatening them at the onset, with a more accurate label, which would be challenging white supremacy conference.
I suspect that is most likely accurate. In fact, that's why I told him the workshop that I would like to do next year is how the white privilege conference reinforces the system of white supremacy. He told me to submit a proposal, and he would see if they could get it as a part of the conference next year. But I think that is a huge aspect of how that conference reinforces white supremacy, not giving it the most accurate label. And I just think the word privilege in general, like I've just seen where once you throw that word in, you have a lot of room to deviate from talking about how awesome, nearly perfected this system is, and the devastating ramifications for non-white people. And I witnessed that over and over at the conference. And again, I spoke with Dr. Moore about this. This is not, anything behind his back or anything. And he'll be on the program next week. I guess before I hit the phone lines, because people did call in, let me make sure. Okay. Given, I said, I've concluded white people are not going to stop practicing white supremacy. I think if this is going to change, I think non-white people are going to have a serious reevaluation of white people. And I think that would have to conclude an accurate assessment of what it means to be white, meaning racist, white supremacist. And I think it would require a total change in how non-white people think of and relate to white people. Do you think that makes sense? Do you think that would be helpful?
I do. I think that would be helpful, and I think it does make sense. I did want to say one other thing about identifying the conference by white supremacy, if I may.
Go ahead.
That white people, in particular, when they think of, oftentimes when white people think of white supremacy, they're thinking of neo-Nazis, KKK, and the like, rather than everyday white supremacy. So my guess is that also played a role in the name of the conference.
I think that's, or at least I'll speak for myself, that's a major part of the work that I do in trying to provide clarity around what racism, white supremacy is, what that means, and how it works. That's why I begin every program with a definition of racism, white supremacy, and really work to erode that notion so that people don't think white supremacy, Ku Klux Klan, they think white supremacy and, Tim Wise, the guy next door, just, a radical shift in what that means. Given that, at the conference, and I'm bringing this up because I got feedback on this from Dr. Moore, which I found fascinating. At the conference, I spoke with you after the workshop, tremendous. We had quite a long dialogue, and you requested a hug. And I said, well, didn't you just say you're a racist? And you said, yeah. And shook hands, no problem. Dr. Moore found me like 30 minutes later, and he said, did a white person ask you for a hug and you refused? And I was like, what? Somebody ratted on me. Did you tell Dr. Moore that I wouldn't give you a hug?
No, No, absolutely not. I actually felt kind of, well, I felt a bit ashamed of myself for having asked after I just finished critiquing all of the kumbaya stuff. I ended up just turning around and participating in it by making the request. So, no, I absolutely didn't say anything to anyone and just reflected on my own role in lending toward the kumbaya nonsense that is not helpful.
Wow. Someone ratted on me, and I think that right there is racism, white supremacy at the white privilege conference. The fact that it was, and get this, after all you talked about with anti-miscegenation, that a black male refused to hug a white person, that was grounds to go and tell the director of the conference. That is fascinating.
Well, yeah, that it was perceived as something wrong is what's troubling to me.
Wow.
If anything, the goal of the conference, it would seem to me, would be to make that sort of rejection understandable, completely understandable.
Wow. I'm glad. I will ask Dr. Moore about. That cannot be. This will be my last comment. Then I'll go to the. That cannot be. That absolutely cannot be because he's married to a white person.
Yes, he references that, but I mean that's his story to tell. I can't speak to that, but that is the goal of the conference, or my understanding of it is that, look, I was challenged in that conference in so many ways, and I participated in causing harms to non-white groups. I mean, frankly, I do it every day, but at that conference, at least, there's a heightened awareness of the workings of white supremacy. But even with that, there wasn't a day and rarely an interaction where I wasn't like, God, look what I did. I used this terminology. I referenced the historical claim, or excuse me, a contemporary claim without giving statistical context. And so in all those ways, especially as a white person, I participate in harm and I participate in reasserting white supremacy.
Were you challenged by? Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I was. Let me tell you, the one place that I got a direct challenge was from a woman of a First Nation, and she really didn't want. What I was struggling with was I was trying to ask people of First Nations what label could be used when you're talking, when you're working through a historical timeline that covers centuries. It seems to me that I'm looking for some sort of label that I can use to capture these diverse native tribes. And, they didn't want a white person naming them, and who the hell can blame them? White people have earned that in this country. But I left with, here was my struggle, was my plan for this race, class, gender, and the law course I was teaching was to deal with 2 centuries worth of treatises with First Nations, and I really struggled with, well, am I going to give this lecture even though I struggle with this language and I'm labeling people who have basically told me stop labeling me, and yet I don't have terminology to really allow me to conduct this this lecture. And I gave the lecture. I began it by telling my students my struggle and the critiques of a white person coming up with labels for these people, and I proceeded with the lecture. But I really, I got called out on a whole bunch of things, and it was, for me, it's not. When I first got into this racial awareness work, and began to confront my own white supremacy, I did sort of the typical middle-class white women Christian stuff, and that was, I would feel hurt, and I don't know, just very, I think, typical responses from those specific social locations. And I'm not there, thank goodness. I'm in a different place, and there's little that one can project at me as a white person that I'm not pretty understanding of, because frankly, I don't know how so many non-white people can be even remotely nice to white people.
I saw a ton of non-white people being very nice to white people at the conference. Not that I advocate being discourteous with white people, but a complete overhaul in our thought and perception of white people that is translated into a new way of thinking, speaking, and behaving with relation to white people. And I can't say that I saw that at the conference, but, Dr. Moore next week will continue. Are you cool with taking a few calls before we wrap things up?
I'd be happy to.
Okie dokie. Last four digits, 6232. Last four digits, 6232. Your mic is open.
Hi, Professor Battalora.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, I have a couple of questions for you. I'll try to make it brief. I was wondering your opinion as a white person, let's say from the outside looking in. If you were to see a situation where a black female was married to a white male, but basically spent a lot of time berating her own people, particularly black males, the black community, anything connected with black people, how likely do you think it would be that her white husband, who's married to a black female like that, would be a racist white supremacist? And in situations where you find a lot of those types of black women married to white men, do you think that the white men who marry those type of black women really love black women, black people, or just particularly black women who are trying to negate their blackness? I mean, sometimes you see a white male with a black female, and I know a lot of black women will think, oh, white men really love us. They really do. But when you look at the type of black women some of them are married to who seem to hate being black, it just makes me wonder, do they really love black people, or is it, it's a little confusing to me. I just wanted to know your perspective if you saw a situation like that.
Boy, well, you know what, maybe this gets to maybe the best way to respond to your comments and question is to get back to that, my claim anyway, for what it's worth to folks to consider, that we are actually, white supremacy is a requirement for success in U.S. culture. So let me link that to this situation that you have posed of a black woman who degrades black people generally and who is married to a white male. I think that blackness is degraded unquestionably by white people, but also by non-white people. And we do it in all sorts of subtle ways. You look at standards of beauty, beauty practices where the silky white-like hair is what's to be achieved. Look at these practices. They are, it seems to me, some of the evidence of white supremacy that is absorbed, and absorbed how? Absorbed in self-hatred, absorbed in animosity and dislike and disapproval of a community of people. It manifests in so many ways, and it's so difficult to speak to people as types of black women or types of white men. I mean, certainly if I knew of a black woman who spoke freely of black people in derogatory ways and was married to a white man, I would suspect that particular white man would seem to be a white man who doesn't at all love black people at all, because if that white man did have a love of black people, then that sort of discourse would not be tolerated. It simply wouldn't. I don't know if you have any follow-up questions. Did I address your concerns?
My own perspective, I see, like, if I were to marry a man, let's say from Mexico, I couldn't possibly imagine marrying him if he hated all the Mexican females. It's like, well, what about your mom? You know, if he hated his people,
Yes.
that wouldn't seem like a whole healthy person to me.
Yes, and I absolutely agree with you. I just always want to fold in the pressures of a larger culture that is within which white supremacy is embedded in every single crevice. So you know what I mean? I don't want to. We often want to look at things at a more individualistic way, and we do have to look at it in that way. But we also have to look at, I think, the larger social forces and pressures, and then of course global components as well. Let's put it this way. It makes a lot of sense to me when so many non-white people who are allowed in as honorary whites, what is the cost to them? What is a common pattern among those that we can think of in our own contemporary context? So often, those who become, and I'll call them honorary whites, part of what the cost is to be included in whiteness, in that honorary sense, is the willingness to degrade blackness. That's part, I think, of the evidence of white supremacy and its pervasiveness, whether one is white or not.
I think some people have got on the white team by doing that, mistreating black people, other non-white people. I know Matthew Fry Jacobson, he talks about that a lot in Whiteness of a Different Color. He was on the program. Yeah, I agree with that. I'm just throwing my 2 cents in. I agree wholeheartedly.
Let me add to your 2 cents. What I'm trying to offer is that becoming a contingent white, that is a mechanism. That being degrading black people is a mechanism that can allow one to become an honorary white. There are other ways to become an honorary white. You make a boatload of money, and we can think of other people who have become honorary whites through other mechanisms. But one mechanism that is significant is, and it's supported historically, especially when you look at David Roediger's historical work of immigrants who came, who today would be called white, but when they first came to this country, they were certainly not seen as white, but part of how they won their whiteness was to degrade black people, to make themselves other from black people. And so the terrible part is that black people get to become honorary whites through that same mechanism. Degradation of your own people.
Including yourself.
Exactly.
Excellent. Call 6232. Someone called in. Your number is showing as 111. If you have a question for Dr. Battalora, you are on.
Can I be heard? Hello?
Yes, sir. We can hear you. Yes, sir.
Thanks for taking my call, Gus. I'm calling in for a question for your guest. It seems like I actually heard everything you said. Basically, white people receive privilege because of white supremacy. Now, when you go about asking white people to recognize they receive a privilege, as a white person, you're white, right?
I am.
You're a white woman? Okay.
That's correct.
As a white person, why would white people stop receiving a privilege to help non-white people with no benefit for them? Why would they ever want to do that?
Let me tell you why. Because there is a harm that comes with white supremacy, and this is what I'm trying to get to in my current work. I'm desperately trying to finish a book, and the latter part of this book shows that, I mean, look, we don't have to go into the details of all of the goodies that white people get as a result of the embeddedness of white supremacy in our culture, in our laws, in every system that exists in this country. But here's what I think lots of us have forgotten in that conversation, and that is that white supremacy harms. And if you want to see the evidence of that, what I think can most powerfully capture it is to look at the photos of lynchings, photos that were actually sold as postcards, as souvenirs of the mutilation of human beings by white people. Many of these postcards, these souvenirs, reveal white people, little children, white people smiling. It was a social event. It was nothing. In fact, a number of them, it's pretty obvious that it was a Sunday afternoon. People are in their Sunday clothes. So I don't know about you, but oftentimes when, for instance, when I've taught about the Holocaust, we often talk about, what happened to those German soldiers, to those folks who were in the SS. What happened to their humanity? How could they treat another human being like that? And even today, we often hear, with regard, particularly in Chicago, where I'm speaking to you from, we hear about gang violence, and they talk about gang members as what is wrong with these kids? What has happened to them that there's an implication that they've lost their humanity by virtue of the fact that they can participate in extinguishing lives so easily. So as a white person, I can say that I get all sorts of financial and symbolic things that advance me, cause me to be seen and see myself as superior. And I also know and am becoming more and more aware of the fact that supremacy has squished my full humanity. I am not fully human, and I would argue that no white person is fully human because of white supremacy. Because white supremacy teaches me from the minute I am born and start to absorb these ideas that certain groups of humanity are less than. That to see people that way, it seems to me, is a degradation of one's humanity. And so in that way, that's one of the incentives, I think, for white people. But in a capitalist economy, is that enough to get people on board to start challenging it? Only the future will tell. But I don't think we should lose that which is a harm of white supremacy for white people. Of course, it's a bigger harm for non-white people who have hung from trees, but it is also a harm to white people.
Let's see. Person, last four digits, 5128. If you have a question for Dr. Battalora, your mic is open.
Yes, hi. Question. Earlier in the show, you mentioned the European elite, I guess as referring to the British or, I guess, the powers that be at that period of time. In your opinion or in your studies, does this elite still exist?
Yes, it does. Whether we can draw a direct line back to the group that I was originally referring to, and really the most proper identification of that group would have been the plantation elite. because remember, I was specifically drawing upon historical and legal information specifically from Maryland and Virginia, because they were at the forefront of crafting these laws that were an abrupt break from British common law, and revealed the opportunities that this new land, at least new for the British, posed to them in terms of power grabbing and money-making opportunities. So, of course, there's a link. Is it a direct line, even from family heritage? I can't answer that for sure, but the link is in the systems that this plantation elite put in place. And what are those systems? I referenced them originally. They are systems of patriarchy that is specifically white, systems of capitalism that again was unique. Even though there are other capitalist systems, the one that took hold and continues to have its grip in this country is one that depends upon masses of significantly underpaid laborers. And so when we look at who the capitalists are today, it's the same kind of system. And there have been studies, and I can't cite the facts, I apologize, I've just heard about them, studies of the tremendous links among those who have been the president of this country throughout its history and the familial links. I suspect if we did a study of the capitalist elite in the United States, that we would in fact draw tangential, if not more direct, links to some of those original plantation elite.
Let's see. Someone else called in at 111. If you have a question for Dr. Battalora, your mic is open.
Hello, Dr. Battalora.
Hello.
Could you talk a little bit more about British, when you're talking about the Bacon Rebellion and part of that being more access to white women, could you talk about the British and how were they able to get married? I mean, what were the laws? Did the women hold the wealth? And could you speak on, did the British see themselves as God's people? Did they put themselves in that type of category?
What I can tell you is that, at least in terms of the laws at the time, there was certainly plenty of references to links, rather, between British and Christian. And so I don't think it's unfair to make the jump that British saw themselves. And we have to be a little careful here because, I think one of the things, Gus, I said during my lecture is that I didn't want people to leave the presentation and think, oh, well, we can just blame whiteness on the damn British, as if it originated from their ideas. But that would be inaccurate because while the British were more numerous in terms of that plantation elite in this country, it was the specific context that colonial North America provided that caused the British to shape their ideas about bodies the way that they did. And in fact, many of their ideas about divisions among people that the British elite in the colonial context believed in and developed were contested by barristers in Great Britain. We have to be very careful not to recognize that British and those seen as like the British who wielded tremendous power in the colonial context, that their ideas were shaped regarding what today we would call, in these racial ways, because of this, in part because of this very unique context, and specifically in response to the power grabbing and economic advantages that became possible in this context. Right, because we don't want to lose the link between the creation of black slavery and the advancement of capitalism for white people, and its link to our version of capitalism's link to white supremacy.
Well, I will see we have about 5 minutes. Before we wrap things up, I wanted to make sure I said this again, because it's rare to have a white person who speaks truthfully about what it means to be white in a system of white supremacy, and then to provide a wealth of information to support that. To say that to be white means to be a racist white supremacy, a racist white supremacist. That's not being an extremist. That's not being radical. That's not overgeneralizing. Would it be correct to say that to anyone to say that being white means you are a racist white supremacist that is accurately articulating what it means to be white in a system of white supremacy?
My work is completely consistent with that description.
Okay. This is my view. I feel that any white person who is not willing to tell the truth about that, and at the same time alleges to be working against racism, white supremacy, and says that they're knowledgeable about racism, white supremacy, and they're unwilling to concede that lets me know a lot about their commitment to really being honest about what's happening here and really just speaking truthfully. And that's all I ask of anyone, whether they're white or not white. If you're going to work against racism, white supremacy, at least speak truthfully to the best of your ability. We all make errors. I make a ton of them, but to the best of your ability, work to speak accurately about this problem. And I think that's a big part of it, a huge part of it. I'll be much more confident in voicing that on the program, that to be white means racist white supremacist. I'll point folks to this program to get the evidence on that. I guess, I'll pitch it to you. Do you have anything you would like to sign off with? If it's research you'd like to point people to, your book, you can let us know when that'll be coming out so we can look for it. Anything you would like to share before we wrap things up, Dr. Battalora?
Well, I'd love to share nothing more than telling you when my book's coming out, but I'm afraid I don't know that yet. I have to finish. You know what? I guess I would like to end with this. There is so much ignorance with regard to U.S. history and the embeddedness, and it's actually its foundation and its foundational documents being built upon white supremacy. There is such ignorance about it, and particularly on the part of white people. And so what that tells me is that where I think our efforts could really serve to improve things is to get history books at the youngest ages possible in our public school system to reflect an honest history. Because, I deal with college-age students in my classrooms, and it's the white students who are the most outraged when they learn some of this history, partly because the non-white students are more familiar with at least some pieces of it. And the white students are just outraged that they never learned this. And so I know that there's an effort underway to have grade school history books published out of Texas with a very disconcerting view of history. And we need to stop that effort. We need to make sure that we are learning truth, as you say, Gus, a more truthful versions of this country's history.
I agree. just telling the truth, and using the most accurate terms. I'm a big fan of that as well, using the most accurate terms. I hope this has been worth your time and energy. I thoroughly enjoyed and appreciated having you come on the program. I strongly suspect the information was very constructive. I have to check in with listeners, but I think it was very helpful, and very grateful for you coming to hang out with us for a bit. I will definitely be in touch, and I'm hoping Dr. Moore comes through. I told him how much I enjoyed your workshop and that I think you should be one of the keynote speakers next year. Actually, I told him that your workshop should be required for everybody who comes to the White Privilege Conference. They should sit through your workshop to get a better understanding of the foundation of white supremacy. So hopefully, well, maybe that'll happen next year. You can be one of the keynote speakers
All right.
at the conference.
Well, it was
I will definitely.
It was an honor to be with all of you. Thank you very much for